Well, that concludes the business of the day. Of course, Finance Minister Godongwana has just delivered his midterm budget policy statement. He calls it a positive statement in some parts. Our reporters are, of course, in Cape Town on standby to give us the very latest in terms of reactions from political parties as well as key players. Of course, our reporters Nompumelelo Siziba, Abra Barbria, as well as Bulelani Philip will bring us analysis and a lot of the reactions. So, of course, one of the big things coming out there is assistance to SOEs and, of course, the e-tolls matter that was affecting Gauteng, of course, being one of the things that have been discussed there. But let's now go to one of our reporters, Abra Barbria, who is on standby. Abra, thank you so much for your time. I'm sure a lot of reaction coming out of this midterm policy statement. Talk to us about what political parties are saying.
I am actually going to get them to talk to you about it themselves. Thank you very much. Steve, thank you, Mr. Swart, thank you for joining us. You had a lot of expectations when we spoke earlier on. The revenue windfall, you tell us what were your thoughts?
Well, I think the 83 billion rand tax windfall must be used for fiscal consolidation. That is to reduce our debt and, of course, to improve the social network. And so that we do see is going to happen. We see that some of the debt will be reduced with that tax windfall, and we see 350 rand a month. The social relief grant will be extended. Our concerns are obviously the bailouts and, of course, the public sector wage bill, which has been penciled in at 3%. We know the unions are not going to accept that, so that can obviously escalate government debt levels if there is a concession there. The bailouts to SOEs are problematic as well, as it was undertaken in the past that it would not be necessary. And, of course, the debt now from Eskom that will go across to the sovereign debt levels, which will increase the sovereign debt levels. Eskom's problems need to be addressed. It's devastating to businesses and the economy, and it needs to be addressed. But this is a balancing act. We'll see the detail in February's budget, and we'll be studying that from the ACDP's perspective.
Mr. Swart, thank you so much for your time. I'm now going to have a chat with Voted Vessel of the Freedom Front Plus. Let's start with the issue of bailouts. That seems to be something that lots of political parties were looking out for beforehand, and now it's as though your worst fears have been realized.
It has been realized, and the fact of the matter is that government debt is out of control. We're talking about 4.75 trillion rand in government debt. The debt service cost is out of control, and the fiscus can't afford it. And now a lot of the debt of these failed state-owned entities, such as Denel, is being absorbed by the state. And that is an unsustainable fiscal position that we are now in. A lot of money that is appropriated in the adjustment appropriation bill, although the minister is talking about prioritizing, for example, the corruption, the prosecution of those that have been named in the Zondo Commission report. If you compare the additional money that Justice is getting to other departments, then it's ludicrous. Department of Defense is getting 1.7 billion rand added to the baseline, whilst Justice is only getting 83 million. It's completely not actually what he said in there, and what's in the budget is not the same thing.
Mr. Wessels, thank you so much for your time. Let me just grab Yomzi Kwankwa of the UDM. I'm gonna shoot straight to bailouts with you as well, because this is a big issue for many parties. And then also let's talk about the fight against corruption while I have you.
Well, firstly, I think our sense is that this budget is like a poorly made homemade chakalaka. It's all over the tin, lacking focus. But also it's supposed to be spicy, but it lacks spiciness. There's nothing to celebrate out of it because it lacks focus. The issue about bailout packages that the government continues to dole out to entities is that they do not address the structural issues and challenges of these entities. Let me remind you that of the 570 billion rands that we've doled out in guarantees, government guarantees to entities, Eskom accounts for 70% of that, more than 70% of that. And that tells you that we keep bailing out Eskom without addressing the underlying root causes of the problem and governance challenges. The other issue here is that there seems to be no accountability all the time. What we do, we promise, the government promises that people are going to be prosecuted, people are going to be held to account for their actions, but we don't see any politicians being arrested. But what is happening is that we continue to bail out entities. You can't, for an example, this budget doesn't tell you how you're going to grow the economy. Unless you saw it, I didn't. There's nothing about how to grow the economy. There's an acknowledgement that the projection over the medium term is 1.6%, but from what? I'm much obliged to you.
I'm so sorry about that. Let me now just link to my colleague Bulelani, who's on the other side of the floor. Bulelani.
Well, thank you so much, Abra. Of course, a lot of talking points on this midterm budget by the Finance Minister. Joining me now is the DA spokesperson on finance, Dr. Dion George. Dr. George, coming into this budget, you were hoping for several issues. Has the Minister struck the right chords in terms of delivering on what your expectations were?
No, the Minister fell very short of expectations. On growth, we were expecting at least some indication of how we would grow the economy. Instead, he confirmed what we already know, is that government wants to place itself at the centre of our economy. Also, the bailouts to the state-owned enterprises basically confirms that the idea is we'll keep on trying this developmental state with a dysfunctional government at the centre of it. So nothing in terms of how to grow business, especially small and medium and micro enterprises, and nothing about entrepreneurship. On debt, we were expecting at least some positive signs. Government has been saying that it was going to reduce debt over the next 2 years, but with a massive increase now on taking over Eskom's debt, possibly between 126 billion and 260 billion, that's going to push the debt up. So we're going the wrong way. We do not support the transfer of Eskom's debt onto the national balance sheet for the people to pay for. There can be another model. Also, if you look at support for vulnerable people, the Minister was completely silent. He never even mentioned the word cost of living. He never mentioned food. He never mentioned that. So vulnerable South Africans are completely left behind. We do support the extension of the social grant. As you know, the DA has committed to a conditional basic income grant of 585 Rand a month. We have also expanded the basket of zero-rated foodstuff. The Minister mentioned nothing about that. So we will continue pushing on that. We do support the additional money to the National Prosecuting Authority. We do want to avoid grey listing at all costs. So on a whole, we think that it was a budget from a broken government, and it does not take us forward. In fact, it confirms what we already knew, that our economy is stagnant and government does not know what to do.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Dion George, the spokesperson on finance for the DA. For more reaction, we're going to cross back to Abra on the other side.
Bulelani, thank you very much. With me right now, the Deputy President of the EFF, Mr. Floyd Shivambu. Mr. Shivambu, thank you for speaking to us earlier on when I spoke to your colleague beforehand about expectations. One of the things that came up is obviously the concern about the rising cost of living for South Africans. How much of that was enough about that said during the speech today?
No, look, there is nothing dependable and meaningful which the Minister of Finance said in terms of how do you ameliorate the fact that a lot of our people cannot afford basic services due to the rising cost of fuel, of food, of transport, and of a variety of basic necessities. So there is nothing which was presented by the Minister of Finance today, but at a macro level, the biggest crisis that we're confronted with as South Africa is the fact that the biggest expenditure item in South Africa's budget is to pay for debt services. So at more than 300 billion rands, like you take more than 300 billion rand to pay for debt services in a context where the economy is not growing, in a context where you have not come up with anything to resolve the energy and electricity crisis in particular. That how are you going to grow the economy if you do not have a clear, dependable plan in terms of how you are going to resolve the electricity crisis so that you can grow the economy and then you are able to expand your revenue base and you are not drowned in paying off the debt services. That currently is the hallmark of this revised medium-term budget presented by the Minister today. It's one of the saddest realities that we have got a debt which is 70% of the overall GDP at 4.7 trillion rand. And it's one of the things that has to change much more drastically. We need to resolve the energy crisis, the electricity crisis in South Africa. And we must not mislead ourselves that we can solve the electricity crisis without relying and depending on coal as our base load, because there is no renewable energy sources that are going to electrify the entirety of South Africa. We have to come out clear that our base load currently is coal. We are still even constructing Medupi and Kusile to add into the national grid to provide proper, dependable coal. Let us explore different alternatives in terms of the reliability of electricity. There's no economy that can be saved. There's no people who can be developed without a dependable and reliable supply of electricity. And that is the major issue that did not come out of what Godongwana said in today's budget process.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Shivambu. I now believe I'm crossing to my colleague, Nompu. Nompu, over to you.
Of course, the Finance Minister, Godongwana, has just delivered the medium-term budget policy statement. It seems as though National Treasury has revised economic growth downwards just by 0.2 percentage points to 1.9% in the 2022-2023 fiscal year. There is some good news. There is a revenue overrun that is indeed National Treasury has collected, or SARS has collected, much more money than was anticipated in the February 2022 budget. I'm joined by the SARS Commissioner, Edward Kiswita, who can just expand a little bit on why that could be. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. So an overrun of over 83 billion rand for this fiscal year. That's the estimate. Of course, that could change as we get towards the end of next year in terms of the fiscal year. What do you attribute to that?
Well, if you highlight a few good news stories, first of all, we've seen an increase in household consumption, an increase in domestic demand as we see through imports, and then also exports have increased. All of these are factors which influences various of the tax aspects. We've also seen an upward growth in the financial services sector as well as the mining sector. So we've seen a positive impact from some of the economic areas, activities that have supported the revenue. And then, of course, there is the continued and consistent rebuilding of SARS. And so we're seeing a growing compliance dividend. A compliance dividend is the revenue that we collect from the administrative actions that SARS executes through our 12,500 staff, which includes collecting debt, following up outstanding returns, doing audits and investigations, all of which collectively have this year contributed to 12% of the total revenue that we have collected so far year to date. So we are encouraged by that ongoing progress that we are seeing through the rebuilding work at SARS.
Excellent work, SARS Commissioner. I'm going to let you go since we do have the Finance Minister with us, but thank you very much, and long may that continue, the efforts that SARS is making in collecting further revenue. I'm joined by the Finance Minister, Godongwana. Of course, he's just delivered the mid-term budget policy statement. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. So you delivered the mid-term budget, always a very difficult balancing act to be able to do. You've got good news on the revenue front, and you've decided to use that leverage to deal with the debt service costs as well as our key priorities like education and health and so on. Tell us more.
Yes, I mean, first and foremost, we focus on investment in infrastructure, focus on providing the social services which are critical, health and education. And crime is a major issue. It affects the economy as well. It's not only a safe issue. We're putting more resources. We've got 10,000 policemen that are being recruited now. Over the next 3 years, we want to add an additional 15,000 police. That in itself is beginning to provide basic services. The infrastructure is going to go across the board from a rural bridge, as we have seen, to water services, to roads, to everything. We want provide those services to our main people, but do it in a sustainable way. That's why much of the more than expected revenue is being focused on debt stabilization.
Minister, you know, there's always a concern among South Africans. They watch the budget speech and then they say, oh, well, more promises, like you're talking about better capacitating the state and all of that and all these plans. How are you going to ensure that these things that you've announced actually come to fruition sooner rather than later?
Let me just say, for instance, the rural bridges, already there's activity done by the SNDF, the army is helping us there, back one.
insofar as the other infrastructure, we're beginning to create two instruments. One, that's going to help the development of that infrastructure. B, that's going to make sure that in a centralized way, we can make sure we can supervise the execution of that infrastructure.
I guess we were getting ahead of ourselves that you were going to give us lots of details about the shifting of Eskom's debt to the national balance sheet. But just give us some sort of sense of what options you're looking at in terms of debt instruments without it going over people's heads. Yeah.
Let me just tell you, I'm not what is called these people who run with debt instruments. That's the one that have frustrated me today. I would have liked to have made my decision. Two kinds of professionals have made my work difficult. Lawyers. And these people who are designing these debt instruments were not ready to provide me with a debt instrument.
All right. The public sector wage issue. Now, you've decided to make, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, you've decided to make a provision of 3% increase over the medium term.
No.
Okay, correct me.
The 3% is an increase for the 2022 fiscal year, starting from the 1st of April 2022 to the end of March 2023. Now, for the next medium-term expenditure, we are expecting to go back into the bargaining table with the unions and emerge with a new figure.
Okay, but what about this whole issue of bargaining on a year-on-year basis? Doesn't that create uncertainty for you as government?
It does. Mind you, we budget on a medium-term basis over a 3-year horizon. So it makes sense for us that I know the numbers over a 3-year horizon. But there has been a break in relation between the unions and in government. There was a 3-year agreement which the unions in 2018, the unions felt the government didn't honor. So we're still building that relationship to go back to a 3-year agreement.
Minister, thank you so much for speaking to us at SABC News. That was Finance Minister Godongwana just speaking to us after having delivered the midterm budget policy statement. Let's hand over to Bulelani Philip now.
All right, thank you so much, Nombu, and welcome back here on the steps of the Cape Town City Hall, where we're taking more political reactions. Joining me now is IFP MP Inkosi Mzamo Buthelezi. Thank you, sir, very much for your time. Firstly, let's start with the elephant in the room. Government announcing that it's going to take over a portion of the Eskom's debt, as well as extend other bailouts to other state-owned enterprises, of course, with strict conditions. Your thoughts as the IFP?
We are very disappointed because even those concerns they will put, they won't be followed through. We have heard similar of this. As the IFP on record saying that these state-owned entities must be open for privatization. So there is nothing that is ever going to change their cause. There is nothing that government can do because the problems of all the SOEs has nothing to do with finance, but everything to do with the leadership that is put there. I think the biggest enemy that we should deal with, the biggest elephant in the room was very interested in the intro of the minister, where he highlighted a number of challenges, and the most particular one is the weaknesses of the state, which translates to saying that the ANC itself is very weak, and that is where we must start to remove the ANC and then come up with clear plans as to how to solve the issue of state-owned entities. The bailouts, we don't support that. We're very disappointed. We hope the minister was going to say something different.
On issues of social relief, particularly dealing with issues of poverty and the high cost of living in the country, did the minister appease your expectations?
Yes, he did, because even in the morning we said that we expect him to actually extend the grant, because we know that the majority of our people are not working. So while we are still struggling to put our economy back into track, then those assistance should be continuously given to them. While we understand that they should not be permanent, we also hope that minister spoke to the issue of assisting small and medium businesses, because that is what will help us to deal with the challenge of unemployment.
All right, thank you so much, Inkosi Mzamo Buthelezi from the IFP. I'm going to bring into this conversation Mr. Sheikh Imam from the NFP. Mr. Sheikh Imam, thank you so much for your time. As the NFP, how do you see this delivery of the medium-term budget policy statement?
Well, let me welcome the press statement by the Minister of Finance. Of course, a lot of what we've anticipated, particularly if you look at infrastructure development, although, he hasn't addressed the concerns that have been raised from time to time, that we do not have the capacity to implement infrastructure projects in the country. And, in terms of the last financial year, we've also had a lot of underspending. On the issue of Eskom, he's talking about government taking over the debt. Remember that if government does not take the debt, there's a significant threat to the economy or the stability of the country as a whole, because Eskom is now reached a crisis point where they will not be able to service the debt. So we have a problem as far as that goes. Exactly the same thing with SANRAL, with the toll fees. Of course, SANRAL anticipated revenue which they're not getting, so they find themselves in a very, very difficult position. I'm glad that he talks about enhancing the manufacturing industry in order to create jobs. My only difficulty is this, that we've heard this before in the last medium-term budget policy statement. And whether we have the capacity to implement this or we have the political will to be able to do this, is a matter for concern. Another important point is that, of course, he is making allocations available, particularly for the security cluster to deal with state capture report and things, which we welcome. But I think, overall, it's a very, very difficult economic situation in the country. And, many countries worldwide are experiencing a similar situation. But I think we need to support the minister. And remember, if you look at the issue that he talks about crime, and he's got funds again allocated, but we are saying the solution to crime in the country is not allocating more and more police officers on the ground, but rather getting to the root causes of crime, which is the socio-economic conditions, the high levels of unemployment, the dysfunctional families. You've had last year 91,000 children giving birth to children in the country, and we think it's okay.
All right, thank you so much. That's all the time we have for you. For now, Imam Sheikh from the NFP. For more reaction, I'm going to cross over to Abra Babia.
Pulelani, thank you very much. I'm speaking with Mr. Stephen Jafta of the AIC right now. Sir, earlier on you said to me that you were quite happy about announcements made in regard to spending to education and health. But you said in terms of the energy crisis, you don't feel enough was said.
Yes, thank you very much. As I said, I don't think the South Africans had enough, because they expected a lot from the minister today, given the situation in South Africa, that the economy is declining and seemingly there are no proper plans by the government, or specifically the Ministry of Finance, to save the country from that situation. And also, if you look at the problem of the energy crisis, it is also clear that there is no solution that will be put in place soon or sooner. Also, if you remember, at the beginning of the year, the minister promised that they will be having some plans to employ more youth. There was nothing that the minister said about the employment of the youth today. So we are happy, as I said, about the investment that will be made towards the Department of Health, Education and also social development, because those are directly affecting our communities at large.
Mr. Jafta, thank you so much for your time. I'm now going to cross to Mr. Brett Hayden of Good. I know you're possibly happy about the distress, that grant which has been extended.
Yeah, we do welcome the extension of the social relief of distress grant. I mean, it's again an announcement of a temporary extension of a year, but I think realistically government has to accept that grant cannot be withdrawn. There's no way that you can remove from almost 9 million families or individuals the small relief that they're getting from their poverty. So what government should be saying is that we're going to use this as the basis to build a basic income grant or income guarantee, which is a Section 27 right in our country. So yes, we welcome the extension. The idea that it's a one-year extension is fantasy. Ultimately, government has to accept that this has to be mainstreamed into the budget.
And the bailout for SOEs?
Well, I mean, some of the bailouts raise some eyebrows. I mean, obviously Sunrail and Transnet are important SOEs and they do need to function properly. The taking on of some of the debt from Eskom, although there are no details provided, is something that we have to accept. We need Eskom to be able to function properly, and if it has been held back by cash flow problems because of servicing very, very high debt, then the government does need to step in and assist Eskom. We all want a stable electricity supply, and our economy is not going to grow without a stable electricity supply. But I do like what the Minister says about attaching conditions to these financial injections. And one of the conditions that should be attached to any funding to Eskom must be about renewable energy in the future, green energy, and about the just transition.
Brett Hedden of the Good Party, thank you so much for your time. I'm now going back to my colleague, Bulelani Philip.
All right, thank you so much, Abra. Of course, Parliament is convening here at the Cape Town City Hall, where it's being held here because Parliament is still damaged following the fire that torched the institution earlier this year. 2 billion has been put down by the Finance Minister to repair Parliament in the medium term. And now joining me for a discussion on this and recapping of how Parliament intends to actually refurbish and rebuild the institution is the new, also not so new, Secretary to Parliament, Mr. Xolile George. 2 billion down for the institution in the medium term. Is it going to be enough to rebuild Parliament, and when can Parliament reconvene as normal?
Well, thank you very much, Bulelani, and thank you very much to the SABC viewers. Of course, this is a great relief for us in the sense that in the midst of uncertainty with Parliament operating in under not so ideal conditions, where the fire that damaged Parliament severely disrupted our operations, we now have certainty that funds will be allocated from the National Fiscal to start this difficult and complex task of restoring the pride of the nation. So we're quite relieved as Parliament around that part.
Is it going to be enough? Is it going to be enough? That's the question.
Design, Bulelani, will tell us exactly if we are able, based on the assessments that have been done so far, and taking into account that as you implement this project, on average, it might take us 3 years. Our wish is that we must be able to complete it even far less than that, given the urgency to restore. It will then, through detailed design, indicate to us whether we will be able to deliver within that budget, or there may be more estimates required. But what we appreciate is a commitment by the Minister that we will allocate this amount of money to enable Parliament to take leadership role in implementing this project. And this is what we will do. And we are also appreciating the fact that given the impact of the disruption, members have lost offices, more than 490 offices gutted down. So the allocation we have of 118 million rand, which we must implement between now and March, provides much needed relief for us to be able to start looking at offices for members to make sure that what they are yearning for, to come back and operate on a physical setting, we are able to gradually restore that, even if we will not be able to achieve it by March, but at least to begin to make sure that committee rooms that they want to operate physically, the digital infrastructure to support their own operation to perform oversight, as well as offices for members so that they can operate under conditions that support their members. It is our duty to make sure that we are able to ensure that members gradually get back to operating full capacity.
Now, the issue of refurbishing Parliament goes parallel to another process of considering whether is it feasible for Parliament to relocate to Tshwane. How far is that process, and how are you going to reconcile the two?
Well, those are two different streams of conversation. A conversation about whether Parliament must be moved elsewhere will run its own course, and it will be driven as such. And you would appreciate that such a conversation is not an easy conversation. It requires consultations that are extensive. It involves South Africans, involves members, and Parliament will be able to pronounce how it wants to undertake such a conversation in a structured manner. The separate conversations about restoring what we have, because Parliament is a national heritage of South Africans, even if we were to contemplate relocation, for whatever reason, we still have a duty to restore what we have. And our focus now is to make sure that we restore Parliament to what it is, so that this heritage of South Africans, this promise of our democracy, where the heartbeat is, does not continue operating under the disrupted conditions that the 2nd of January brought to us. We're quite happy that by the time we reach 2nd January, the leadership of Parliament will be able to say to South Africans, yes, it might be this unfortunate anniversary, but we now have firm commitment for resources to drive what needs to be done to restore Parliament to its glory.
Thank you so much, Mr. Xolile George. We wish you all the best of luck in refurbishing the institution of Parliament. He is, of course, the Secretary of the Parliament of South Africa. And now joining me for more political reaction is the PAC leader, Mr. Mzwanele Nyonzo, on the issues surrounding the high cost of living. Has the minister actually made sufficient announcements or made interventions that will actually ease the cost of living in South Africa?
No, he has not. In fact, he said what he said last or during the beginning of the year. So he has not addressed the cost of living that keeps on rising in this country every day. Also, he has not. I was also interested to hear what are the measures to apply the grey listing he was talking about, because remember, a grey listing is taking this country into the drain, and he has not come up with clear measures of how to fight grey listing. And also he mentioned that the 400 billion of Eskom debt, bigger portion will be paid by us, but it doesn't tell us how much is that portion that taxpayers will pay into Eskom. So they are also mentioning this thing of renewals, and it really never makes sense to us, because Western countries do not want us to use coal, but they keep on taking coal in South Africa. In fact, France has just received a contract to get coal here for the next 30 years. But they are telling us not to use coal. So he did not come with clear measures. Anyway, we expected nothing from the beginning.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Mzwanele Nyonzo, the president of the PAC. For more reaction, we cross back to Abra.
Who's talking to me?
All right, of course, we're getting reaction there from various political parties following the mid-term budget policy statement. A number of political parties, of course, being very much concerned in terms of government's debt burden. But some of the interesting things that also came out of this, policy statement, of course, saying additional resources to the budgets of the National Prosecuting Authority and the Special Investigative Unit, as well as the Financial Intelligence Centre and the South African Revenue Services, to further improve the capability of the state to investigate and prosecute sophisticated financial crimes. So we'll continue to unpack just some of the things that came out of it. And of course, we will be getting reaction specifically around e-tolls. Now, you will recall the minister saying that e-tolls and the Gauteng Freeway Improvement Project Plan will be handed to the Gauteng province under a new treasury plan. The minister saying that Gauteng will then have to take 30% of the SANRAL's 47 billion rands debt, as well as national government, paying the remaining 70%. So we'll unpack how that will unfold. But let's continue to get reaction now. Let's go back to Cape Town, where Barbara is standing by with more reaction for us.
Now speaking to Gwen Ramahopa, ma'am. Thank you for speaking to us. I heard a lot of critique from the opposition parties. What stood out for you as a positive in the minister's speech today?
I think the minister's speech is very much balanced. From one side between stimulating growth, because that's a more sustainable intervention, and on the other hand also making sure that basic services and social security support is there for the poor and the vulnerable. Amongst others, in addition, the area of justice and security cluster has also been strengthened, because democracy without safety is also a challenge, but also if we leave corruption, fraud, and we are actually bordering on being grey-listed. So those three areas are very critical. In terms of stimulating the economy, he looked at the network industries, your roads, the rail, the areas of water, of energy, of also telecommunications, because that's very critical. This will has a potential of creating jobs to relieve especially the young people from unemployment, but also to stimulate our economy to greater growth levels. On the other hand, basic services, education, health, housing, including also bridges, particularly in Limpopo and Eastern Cape, that will help the communities but also that's also important for the economic, for investment, attracting investment. We're also glad that there are efforts to resolve the public wage negotiations, very positive there. And the area of additional police, we must welcome it, including also the SIUs, the NPA, to also respond to the huge investment we made in the state capture investigations in the commission. So overall, a balanced budget. We are concerned about the high level of indebtedness by South Africa. However, over a period of time, as the economy improves, that debt will also decline.
Thank you so much for your time, ma'am. I'm told I'm crossing to my colleague Nompu now, if that's correct. Nompu?
Thanks very much. We're here in Cape Town outside the City Hall where Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana has just delivered his mid-term budget policy statement. I'm joined now by the Minister in the Presidency, Mr. Mondli Gungubele. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us. Before we talk about the matters of the medium-term budget, we've just received a very worrying alert from the US government. They're warning that there may be a terrorist attack in South Africa, here in Sandton, in Gauteng, over the weekend of the 29th and the 30th of October. What's your immediate reaction to this announcement, and were you aware of this possibility?
Thanks. Listen, I've checked that with my security unit. I want to say it up front, they are a bit disturbed because they say this alarm has been going on. Up to this point, it has not been backed up by any evidence. That's why we place the matter. And
so do you have, in situations like this, would you communicate directly with the US government to try and find out where they're getting this information from, to work with them?
Actually, as far as I'm informed, our teams have been actually following that net for them to give evidence. They have not been able to provide. By the way, it's our primary duty to do that. Once they say it exists, we go further and check. Up to this point in time, and as far as our teams are concerned, we don't have such evidence.
Okay, Minister. And then, of course, looking at the midterm budget policy statement, a fairly balanced delivery. Seems to be a lot of optimism around getting the finances in order. Your perspective?
In a fiscally challenged situation, the biggest challenge is to open a fiscal space so that we've got more money that goes to development. Now, in our situation, unleashing in private sector to actually invest is a primary thing. In other words, creating conditions for that purpose. In other words, our macro stability, what we call fiscal policy sustainability and so on, they are well looked after. Stabilizing the debt and dealing with the reduction of the deficit, and at the same time refusing to cut any budget in the social setup, instead adding to education, adding to police and so on, and increasing the infrastructure spend or reinforcement, because remember the president said our key lever to turn around the economy is infrastructure. There's a huge commitment. The issue of energy being attended to, in particular lifting the Eskom portion of Eskom debt. That decision is there. It's a matter of modalities now. And what else to... it's a balanced budget, that's all we can say.
So the finance minister indicated, and he said it a couple of times in his speech, that the government is not willing to make permanent decisions on things like the social grants or the social relief of distress grant or a basic income grant unless there's more evidence of raising more revenue or cutting expenditure elsewhere. Does this really basically mean it's a fait accompli that the BIG won't happen over the medium term?
If you said, he says the PIG is still on the table, The critical thing about it, there's an agreement in South Africa that you cannot allow poor people who are not employed to go unattended. But the biggest debate in our situation, as far as South Africa is concerned, is to ensure that when you commit long term, there's a guaranteed revenue, whether it's going to be through taxation, whether it's projected reliable economic growth trajectory and so on. To just commit permanently when you have not actually done that, the repercussions are very huge, and the first victims will be the poor themselves.
Indeed. Minister, thank you so much for your time speaking to us here at the SABC News. That's a wrap for us for now. We're going to hand over now to my colleague Bulelani Philip.
All right, thank you once again, Nombu. Of course, now we're going to focus on the crime and security cluster, where we bring in Justice and Correctional Services Minister. Minister Ronald Lamola, thank you so much for your time. Firstly, some additional allocations for your cluster and department in the medium term. Would those be enough to fight crime and corruption?
Yes, that additional funding is welcome. It will definitely help the cluster, including the National Prosecuting Authority, to be able to have the resources they need, both human resource and also the necessary tools of trade, like the digital technology that they need to deal with some of the most complex crimes that are happening in the country, with the alarming rate that is growing of organized crime, including what the President announced with regard to the state capture. So these resources indeed will go a long way to help the cluster, which has always been under-resourced, and we have been raising our issues. And I'm happy that finally Cabinet has changed and now moving towards helping the cluster, and that the Treasury has also heeded the call. So this is a great and good development to invest in the cluster so that the society can feel free and safe to continue with economic activities and their social life.
Now, the action plan for the implementation of the State Capture Commission recommendations has been submitted to Parliament. Can you bring us to speed in terms of how far is the extradition application and request of the Gupta brothers?
Yeah, it is at an advanced stage with the authorities in the UAE, and we are hopeful that it will go through their court processes, and soon we will have a clear outcome in terms of whether they are extraditable or not, which is a court process in the UAE. But we are confident that with the good mutual relations we have with our counterparts in the UAE, once that process is undergone, they will definitely be on their way to South Africa to account.
All right, the news that just come in as we come on air now is that there is a threat to the U.S. Embassy in Sandton. Have you, as the cluster, received any reports in that regard?
Yeah, obviously I cannot comment on that. As you have said, it's a threat. The SABC and the relevant law enforcement agencies will be better placed to speak on such issues, whether it's necessary to comment on them or not. But on my side, I think it will be prudent that I leave it with the South African Police Services.
All right, thank you so much, Minister Ronald Lamola, Justice and Correctional Services Minister. Of course, we're going to try and get more reaction from civil society. I'm going to bring in Matthew Parks from COSATU. I'm sorry to get you so at short notice, but Matthew, the minister making some statements around the wage negotiations in the public service, sticking to the 3% wage hike. As COSATU, how are you taking that?
So the government's announced that they're basically going to implement the offer they made at the PSABC, which is a 3% increase on the baseline, 1.5% cost of living adjustment, 1,000 rand after tax cash gratuity. Parliament is not a place where we negotiate wages. Those are resolved at the bargaining council. There is a process at the CCMA which is starting from Friday for mediation process. We hope government will come to those engagements, will come with an open mind, will engage with Labour so we can find a solution. But we don't think it's correct for government to constantly seek to outsource the bill for corruption, for state capture, for mismanagement of the economy in the state to nurses and doctors who are highly indebted or struggling to survive, to pay their bills, to take care of their families. Public servants didn't get an increase in 2020. They got a hybrid increase last year. They've been waiting 6 months now for an increase. We think government can do better by them because they've been praising our nurses and our police officers for keeping this country afloat for the past few years. Yet our very same ministers refuse to pay for their own electricity bills. So we think government should show some more compassion for our workers who are really struggling. And let's really address the fundamental cause of the fiscal crisis, which is around corruption, where we lose billions. It's around wasteful expenditure. It's around load shedding. It's around economic recession, collapsing SOEs, collapsing municipalities. Let's grow the economy, because that's the way you're going to pay down the debt, not by outsourcing your mismanagement politicians to nurses.
Now, the minister is saying that that kind of agreement or proposal to the unions is based on balancing the fiscus as well as the needs of the public servants. Now, what if today they don't come to the party at the CCMA? What does COSATU do?
Sure, if they don't come, then the unions some of them are already preparing for strikes. Some have already applied for the strike certificate, so that's allowed for under the Labour Relations Act. So you would force public servants to go on strike. Public servants, like all the workers, don't want to go on strike because the rule of no work, no pay applies. Workers can't afford to lose wages. But again, we're dealing with workers who feel very aggrieved, feel very frustrated that government is constantly pickpocketing them, doesn't care about their conditions, their plights. So we think government must go and address these issues because, again, the public service cannot afford a strike. Our home affairs, our schools, our police stations, our healthcare infrastructure is already struggling, is already limping along. So government needs to go negotiate, find a resolution, and stop throwing public servants under the bus.
All right, thank you so much. Matthew Parks is the parliamentary coordinator of COSATU. For more reaction, we cross back to Abra Babia.
Bulelani, thank you so much. I'm now going to be speaking to Mr. Willie Madisha of COPE. At the top of your list of concerns is the rising debt, sir.
Yes, this is extremely disappointing. We had thought that they would deal with very serious problems. For example, the country now owes about 5 trillion in terms of debt. And as a result of that, we can't go anywhere. We had thought that he would talk something about that and say, this is how we're going to address that, but he hasn't. But secondly, is the issue of 400 billion that has got to deal with the issue of electricity, Eskom, etc., etc. And for as long as we still owe there, then it means very many jobs are lost. It means people don't get access to electricity, and that's a very serious problem. Now, talking about debt as well, you may have followed where the Reserve Bank spoke about the increase in terms of the rates. Now, that comes again as a sequel to this issue of debts. Now, because of all that, people don't have jobs, they won't get any in any way, hunger will rise, all these kind of problems that South Africa faces at the moment will actually continue. Therefore, this speech really is a repetition of that which we get each and every year, each and every term, whenever the ministers for finance speak. Hence, I'm saying this is extremely useless, disappointing, and obviously if he has got to come back again after a few months, he will say the same thing, but there is no implementation, and that is why you look around, people are just moving around the streets. It's a hellish kind of a problem.
Mr. Madisha, thank you so much for your time. It's good to speak to you. Mr. Hanif Hendricks of Al Jamaa. Sir, earlier you spoke to me about, when we were talking about your expectations, you spoke about policy changes. Did you hear enough about that today? And also I want to speak to you about the rising cost of living and the effect that has on South Africans.
Yeah, look, the minister alluded to some of the things that he's going to do, which will affect the fiscal policy. And so it's a starting point, because remember, we are working for the budget in February and also the 3-year budget. So I think he's given us some indicators. When it comes to tolls, the toll roads in Gauteng, that was quite a sticky point, and he gave a policy that government will fund 30% of the cost of fixing roads in Gauteng, which means the provincial government will have to find the other 70%. So we feel that the 30% is not enough. It should be 50%, because Al Jamaa is very active in the city of Joburg, and we will be in Gauteng come 2024. So that is pushing a need for Gauteng residents and the city of Johannesburg residents. As far as the minister also indicated that they are going to rebuild Parliament. So that puts that matter to rest of moving to Pretoria. And we are just asking that the new Secretary of Parliament be a bit creative and come up with a budget just to fix the National Assembly, because it's not very convenient here at the City Hall. So at least we have a venue where all 400 members of Parliament can sit especially on State of the Nation address, budgets, and so on. So we are very confident that he has given us enough. That means political party leaders to engage with him going forward, and I hope that he will take some of our recommendations into consideration, because everything the ANC government has done over the last 10 years has failed. Their fiscal policy has failed. They need a new fiscal policy, but he's now laid the foundation for a new fiscal policy.
Mr. Hanif Hendricks, leader of the Al Jamaa party here in Parliament, thank you so much for your time, sir. And of course, you heard him appealing to the finance minister to take on board some of the recommendations and ideas proposed to him by opposition parties to just help strengthen the fiscus overall in South Africa. Nompu, I believe I'm crossing to you now.
Thanks very much for joining us here in Cape Town. We remain outside City Hall, where the Finance Minister delivered the mid-term budget. Now, one of the issues that he talked about was infrastructure. We know that infrastructure is one of the key mantles that President Ramaphosa came into power with, wanting a lot of investment to be made in the economy so as to basically create a more conducive environment for economic growth. Now, the Minister of Finance indicated that up to 112.5 billion rand would be spent this year on things like bridges, on stormwater systems, roads, public buildings. Also, there's going to be investment in the likes of Transnet to the tune of 2.9 billion rand in order to basically develop these assets so that it can also attract the private sector to also invest in those areas. Now, earlier we spoke to Mr. Tennyson. He's the founder of I've forgotten where you're from Property Point, pardon me. And basically he deals in the area of the SME sector, focusing on incubating SMEs and encouraging them and so on and so forth. Thank you very much, Mr. Tennyson, for speaking to us. Now, having listened to the midterm budget, when you hear about this infrastructure spend, does that augur well for your confidence levels for SMEs? Because obviously, if the environment around them is conducive for development and for economic growth, it's good for them.
Yes, I think, Nompu, what we see is that the speech was a bit underwhelming when it came to the mentioning of SMMEs and on entrepreneurship, but I think those indirect elements and spend, for instance, on infrastructure becomes quite conducive for SMMEs. So we want to be able to see how SMMEs are able to play a role in terms of these infrastructure development projects. I think another element that was quite positive was the introduction of the preferential procurement bill that will be coming in place that will focus on efficiency, transparency, hopefully curb down corruption and make it more accessible for SMMEs to be able to gain access to opportunities within the public sector.
So what's your feeling when you hear that the government is hoping, or National Treasury is hoping, for us to reach a situation where we have a primary surplus? In other words, the government spends less than what it actually earns by the next fiscal year. And what are the implications for SMEs? Are you not worried that means that they're going to be investing less in things like SMEs?
No, definitely, and I think that's irresponsible from government side to not be able to spend the fiscus that's available for them to spend. I think from an SMME perspective, they are focused on being able to be participants in both public and private opportunities to be able to create their livelihoods. So I think it's quite pertinent on government to action these policies and plans in order to stimulate growth. I think another element that came out once again from a policy perspective is the removal of the threshold license on solar generation. That's going to be positive for SMMEs in the green economy space as well. So hopefully that creates a new avenue for economic growth as well, and the inclusion of SMMEs.
What about financing in that area? Because we're hearing bits and pieces from the different banks, but you don't really get a sense that the whole financing for that sector, particularly for SMEs, is in place.
The minister said nothing about the bounce back scheme that was mentioned in the main budget speech. So that's disappointing, because we need to create that access to finance for SMMEs in order to be able to participants in these opportunities and projects. So I think very disappointed in that element. Nothing specifically mentioned around financing opportunities and the inclusion of banks and other development finance institutions in supporting small businesses.
All right, thank you very much, Sean. That was Sean Tennyson. He's the founder of PowerPoint. He looks at the area of the SME environment, supporting them, incubating them, and so on. I'm also joined by Kim Silberman. She's an economist from Rand Merchant Bank. Thank you very much, Kim, for joining us. Just give us an overview of what you thought from the budget. Of course, you were plying through the budget documents in lockup, so you had several hours, you were exposed to them. What were the key things that stood out for you, and maybe the headline things, the things that are not headline news that you thought were quite interesting?
Well, it's a very aggressive, I thought very bold budget. You've also seen the markets rally on the back of this budget. Basically, what the government seems to be doing is saying we are going to cut debt. So we're taking a lot of this revenue that we're getting, and they've estimated around 300 billion of revenue, which seems really optimistic, right? Where you're going to get 300 billion is not terribly clear. If the commodities prices don't perform over the next 2 years, where does that 300 billion come from? What they've said is they're going to sell assets and sell equity. So possibly what we're going to see over and above the sale of spectrum, which I think will come into this year's revenue, so that makes this year's revenue actually look quite reasonable. If they sell, for example, their stake in Telkom, possibly that can add to the revenue that they've projected. Now, if the revenue plays out as they've given it, it actually means, and the numbers add up, which is a big if, right? So it's quite an optimistic budget. Then we can actually reduce issuance of government bonds by around 120 billion over the next 3 years. And that means they can stabilize debt this year. I mean, what we usually see in the budget is they're always stabilizing debt somewhere out in the MTF. They're not stabilizing it this year. And to announce that you're going to stabilize debt this year is for me, incredibly ambitious, but definitely the right direction to sort of state that so boldly. So I think it was a very impressive budget from that perspective. There's lots of questions around the numbers, but I think to state that this is their intention has been incredibly positive for markets.
Of course, a couple of key issues. The energy crisis, if that doesn't get resolved, everything else really doesn't matter. And then the issue of growth. We need economic growth, otherwise we can't even begin to address things like unemployment and worsening poverty and so on and so forth. Did you get a message in terms of some of the initiatives, especially when it comes to things like infrastructure, that we're on the right track?
I think what they're hoping for is a virtuous circle. So if you reduce debt, then you're going to reduce risk, and that means you're going to be able to issue debt at a higher price, i.e. at a lower yield. And then you can save on debt service costs, and you can use that money to invest in infrastructure and promote growth. And that's the kind of virtuous circle you want to get into, which is why they're focusing so much on reducing issuance and reducing debt. So that's really the right way to go. And what they've also said is they want to move money away from operating expenses and towards infrastructure. I think, though, they've made quite a lot of noise around that, but when you look at the actual numbers that they're giving to infrastructure, it's still very small. When it comes to Eskom, I think there's going to be some disappointment. Our Treasury promised bondholders, specifically offshore bondholders, that there would be a lot of detail in the budget around Eskom, and there was no detail in the budget around Eskom. So that is going to be a disappointment. But they have increased their allocation to Eskom, and they've said that it's either going to be an equity injection or some kind of loan transaction. I think just continuing with the fact that they are on the right path with debt relief to Eskom is it's the right thing to do, but we needed more detail on that.
Kim, thank you so much for speaking to us. Kim Silberman, she's an economist at RMB, saying that it's a very ambitious midterm budget, that government thinks that it can get to a primary surplus by the next fiscal year, that is 2023-2024. We have to wait and see if that really happens. And then on the Eskom front, when the minister was in Washington, D.C. recently, he did give the market some impression that there was going to be detail given in the midterm budget. But that didn't come to fruition. Having spoken to him, though, just now, he did say that he was hoping to give that detail, but because of complications, he couldn't give the finer details. No doubt come February 2023, that detail will be there because, of course, Eskom is too important to fail, and we also need concrete decisions to ensure that this particular asset is on the right track. Well, that's a wrap from us here in Cape Town, from myself, that is. But before we do go as a broadcast, as a special broadcast, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Abra Barbia. Thank you very much.
Well, Nompu, there you have it, another midterm budget policy statement done and dusted. Colleague Bulelani Philip, what are your thoughts of the day?
Well, I think we've seen this kind of statements and promises from the finance minister, particularly when it delivers his budget votes in February, as well as now later on in the year in terms of the medium-term budget policy statement. But I think the most important thing now that we should actually be holding the finance ministers on is that all the promises that is made here, there must have been some time frames and timelines of when all of these promises are going to be fulfilled. And secondly is that all those additional allocations that have been made in the medium term, particularly for the state-owned companies like Denel, Sanral, as well as Eskom, that there must be value for money for all of those allocations so that they don't continuously rely on the fiscals to actually bail them out and to keep them financially afloat. So I think those 4 things for me should actually be the things that we take a look into and actually rely on in terms of holding the minister accountable. So Abra, from us here, my name is Bulelani Philip.
Bulelani, thank you so much. From myself and Bulelani, we're crossing back to studio now. Auckland Park, back to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, of course, to our reporters there on the ground, Nompumelelo Siziba, Abra Barbria and Bulelani Philip, giving us analysis and reaction there. Of course, we are still very much focusing on that mid-term policy statement delivered by Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana earlier this afternoon. Well, the budget touched, as you've heard, on a number of issues and topics that were raised, especially in the lead-up to the speech, which included, of course, the government taking over a portion of the ailing Eskom's debt and, of course, giving some clarity and a possible solution on the Gauteng e-toll saga. Many political parties and some civic groups, as you've heard, disappointed somewhat by the midterm policy statement, particularly around SOEs and, as I've indicated, particularly around Eskom and, of course, economic growth prospects. Just, of course, we are following up on this and we'll get more reaction on this. And, of course, we're also following up on that breaking news story, as you would have seen, the US Embassy reportedly raising an alarm of a possible terrorist threat to the US Embassy in Sandton. That and more coming up in a moment. We take a quick break.